Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out in the direction of Verbove, where here the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance a further bit in the direction of Verbove, capturing parts of the Russian trenches in this area. We see them now fighting in the direction of the outskirts of Verbove, and there's fighting here by the trenches where the Ukrainians have managed to capture about 20% of those trenches. This is interesting because we see that the Ukrainian forces are continuing their assaults across the trenches. As reported earlier, and I've mentioned, but also yet again, the Ukrainian forces attacking in this direction are actually some forces that go in groupings, platoon-sized groupings, 4, 10, 20 soldiers going together, storming the Russian trenches, and after that they go into these trenches and try to capture. If they avoid these artillery shells, then there's the face-off against Russian soldiers. These Russian soldiers also have armored support, and there are FPV drones flying around, detecting Ukrainian soldiers and then flying down on them. So the Ukrainian forces are facing very heavy fire from the Russian forces whenever they contest these trenches. This is why they're going in these smaller groupings, because if they manage to avoid the visual confirmation of their locations, if they can go unnoticed through these trenches, then they have the advantage. Most likely this IFV comes in because the Ukrainians managed to advance a large bit. They established some positions ahead of the initial entrance to the trench, and as such they were able to advance a significant bit. Then this infantry fighting vehicles going around flanking the Ukrainian forces in the trenches and pushing them back with its armor. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces are nonetheless advancing. This means that their strategy, which they are not just using here in the direction of Verbove, but generally across the front, and have been using it for a couple of months now, this is the strategy that works for Ukraine. It is likely limiting the casualties that they are receiving because they aren't concentrating their forces in huge areas. They're doing minor groupings, and as such they're able to avoid heavy losses in one place. And at the same time, we also see them using the same strategy in the direction of Klishchiivka. Here, the latest reports from a Russian war correspondent in this direction. He says, from his own perspective, a small area on the Bakhmut side of Klishchiivka is still Russian. The location of the video, which showcased the Ukrainians holding their flags, are somewhere in this direction, which they were already under their control. But the fact that they were able to film this means that they were likely not under threat from direct fire. So I do not think they are still holding positions in the north of Klishchiivka, but the railways are likely where they are hiding, as they are in position by the forest lines, and they have some prepared positions here. They have some trenches, they have some fortifications and so on. So most likely they're holding positions here by the forest lines, but they consider it as part of Klishchiivka, as the road leading to Klishchiivka is involved here. But essentially what we're seeing is that the fighting for Klishchiivka doesn't end with the Ukrainian capture of it, because right now the high grounds are what is contested. And according to this war correspondent, the Ukrainian forces have an advantage in artillery overview and adjustment as in accuracy from the air, which is decisive for them, as well as the dominant heights in this direction. The Ukrainian forces have the high ground in this whole area west and south of Klishchiivka, while the Russian forces only have the high grounds here east of Klishchiivka. So the Ukrainian forces have had the height advantage throughout the fighting in Klishchiivka and Andreevka, while the Russian forces were in the low ground within Klishchiivka and had some high ground positions to the east of it. So this war correspondent is saying that these differences are decisive for them. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces actually have an artillery advantage and a drone advantage in this part of the front. He's saying that the Russian forces are being grinded down because they are inferior in the firepower and in manpower in this direction, and that the drones that they're using in this area, they run out of battery power by the night time, and they need to recharge them, and as such the Ukrainian forces have more, and as such they can spread it out more over the 24-hour time frame. So the Russian forces end up with times or gaps within their own observational powers, while the Ukrainian forces have observation 24/7 around the clock everywhere. So essentially, the Ukrainian forces have such a significant advantage in this part of the front line that he's saying that the Russians simply have no way to fight back. This is likely where the news of the Wagner forces returning fit in the picture, because according to the latest information from Ramiland, we see that the Wagner forces have already returned to the front. He says certain units of PMC Wagner have already gone to the front on their own initiative and are already working together with the Russian units in the Artemovsk area, which is Bakhmut. So according to him, according to his sources within Wagner, Wagner soldiers are already fighting and they have started supporting the Russian forces within Bakhmut. And as I said in my analysis, where I analyzed the power balance between the Russian and Ukrainian forces across the whole front, we see that the only areas in which the Ukrainians have a firepower and manpower advantage would be here by Siversk and Bakhmut. So with the location of Bakhmut itself, it's also difficult for the Russians to resupply, as there is essentially only one road that goes through to this area, and it is from Luhansk here behind this area, and then they move all the way down to Bakhmut. This is the only supply line the Russian forces have that is usable for them. So they have one supply line. The Ukrainians are constantly hitting this supply line, so the Russian forces are limited in their supply. But before you say, well, that's a tactical encirclement, not really, because the Ukrainian forces do not have the artillery range to attack this supply line. What they do have is long-range attacks. They have the Storm Shadow missiles, they have other things, HIMARS and so on, which limit the supply but doesn't have a full fire control over it. So all of these reports around Bakhmut actually sound rather depressing for the Russian forces. It sounds like the Ukrainian forces are advancing, they're taking control over areas, they have a firepower advantage, they have manpower advantage, they have observational advantage. So it's not looking that good for the Russian forces, to the point that they're even sending Wagner forces to the front again to help them hold the Bakhmut area. We also see that the Ukrainian forces re-entered Verbove, which is right next to Bakhmut itself. So the Ukrainian forces are having a great time in Bakhmut right now. So how is the Russians able to keep their optimism? Well, according to the latest Russian Ministry of Defense commercial to recruit soldiers, so yes, of course, this is a propaganda video. You don't need me to tell you, but it's very funny nonetheless. They say, and I'll show it here on the screen, it's some Russian soldiers allegedly fighting in a trench. This is, of course, recorded video. It's not under the fire. So these two soldiers are sitting here, and then they are like essentially winning the war. Interesting part is they consider winning the war gaining Kiev. The Russians are now not fighting just for the south, not for the annexed regions. They are fighting for all of Ukraine. Because we see here that the fighting is not just centered around, well, when this war ends, we'll take the Zaporizhia region. But he also says they want to buy an apartment in Kiev, move to Kiev. But if they are Russians fighting for Russia against Ukrainians in Ukraine, moving to Kiev would be essentially defecting from Russia to Ukraine. They're moving to Ukraine, unless they take it, they annex it, they capture it. And then the final sentence I like to see in Odessa. So this video actually indicates that the Russian forces are, quote unquote, forgetting about the southern front, and now planning much bigger, capturing essentially all of Ukraine, Kiev, Odessa, who knows what else. This is, of course, my speculation, but I believe that the Russian forces are now gunning not for southern Ukraine, but for all of Ukraine. So this is further indication that this war is not going to end anytime soon, but it will be a very long one, because the Russians do not have any plans of ending it, and the Ukrainians do not have any plans of ending it. They both believe they have so much more to gain by fighting than by making a peace deal, and therefore there will be no peace deal. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.